Jim, can you spend some time on talking about how the changes to the NEC define reconditioned equipment?
Yes, Phil, there are many changes throughout the NEC that are going to impact equipment and whether you can recondition that equipment or you cannot recondition that equipment. But first, what we need to do is make sure that we truly understand what is reconditioned equipment and what is not reconditioned equipment. There's a new definition in Article 100 of the term reconditioned, and it is electromechanical systems, equipment, or apparatus components that are restored to operating conditions. So what that means right there, that first sentence, is it means we had a piece of equipment that was not in operating condition. There was something wrong and it needed to be repaired. What that does is that completely differentiates used equipment. If I've got a piece of equipment and it's in operating condition and I take it out and I'm going to use it somewhere else, that's not reconditioned equipment. It's very simply used equipment. We get back into the definition and it says, this process differs from normal servicing of equipment that remains within a facility or replacement of listed equipment on a one-to-one basis. That's very important because what that means is if I've got equipment such as a low voltage power circuit breaker and I'm going to maintain it in my facility, that is not reconditioned. That's normal maintenance. It would not be considered as reconditioned. And the facility could be a single building or structure, a campus, or a utility that owns multiple cell sites. There is an informational note here that explains to the user of the code that we use that term reconditioned, but sometimes we say rebuilt, refurbished, or remanufactured. And Chad will weigh in on some products that can be reconditioned and some that cannot.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. As we look at the products in the NEC that are covered, particularly looking at residential, molded case circuit breakers are an example where the NEC is really clear that those products aren't suitable for reconditioning. They would have to be replaced. And as Jim mentioned already, when we think about panel boards and the replacement of panel boards, a panel board is a listed product. So replacing a listed product for a listed product, whether or not you keep the same enclosure, that's still permitted. Things such as transfer switches are not reconditionable. So as we summarize for residential, molded case circuit breakers, panel boards, transfer switches, by code in the NEC now are clearly not items that can be reconditioned by the definition.
That's a key point that you brought out there, Chad, because in the definition of reconditioned, it specifically says at the end of the last sentence that replacement of listed equipment on a one-to-one basis is not reconditioned. So if you have to replace a listed component in a piece of equipment, that would not render it as reconditioned.
Right, and as equipments go through updates, whether that's firmware updates, software updates, this wouldn't impact those as part of reconditioning because that's a product that is in working order and this is normal upgrading or servicing of that equipment.
I think it's important to make a point about the NEMA policy and guidelines that was developed for manufacturers as it relates to reconditioning of electrical equipment. The changes that appear in this cycle of the NEC are largely related to that document as a basis for that information ending up in the NEC.
Yeah, I think actually we have 3 NEMA documents that come into play with this. Alan, I don't know if you want to speak to any of those.
Yeah, we have one that looks at water damaged equipment. We have one that looks at fire damaged equipment, and more recently one looking at equipment that could be damaged from an earthquake situation. So ultimately all providing some great guidance with regard to things that can't be, and then if there are things that could be potentially refurbished or re-looked at, is make sure you contact the manufacturer to understand what conditions we should be looking at with regard to reviewing that product to see if it could be reconditioned or refurbished.
Great.
There are some specific requirements for what you can and cannot recondition. In many cases, there's equipment that we don't mention it at all. We don't tell you that you can, we don't tell you that you can't, but there are requirements for equipment markings that would apply in all cases to any equipment that is reconditioned, and Mike will take us into that.
Yeah, that's a great point, Jim. The process of reconditioning equipment is not new to the industry. It was new in the 2017 edition of the NEC. The first place we see this incorporated into the code is in section 11021A2. And there's three key elements of that. One of them was a change that was incorporated this year, but the key elements of that section relate to the process of reconditioning is now tracked by a required marking from the NEC. It must include the trademark and name of the organization responsible for the reconditioning of the equipment. And it also has to include a process if the product is listed or certified, that listing is undoubtedly impacted by the process of reconditioning, and the original listing marks are required to be removed. There is an exception that still remains in this section of the code for industrial occupancies under conditions of maintenance and supervision, but those are controlled conditions.
Right, and sometimes do the contractors need a third-party evaluation on that equipment?
That's an excellent point, Phil. Many times the authority having jurisdiction is looking for listing or product certification as a basis for approvals. And sometimes you might get into a situation with the reconditioning process where an AHJ, it's a complicated issue. The AHJ is going to request a field evaluation or a field service follow-up, which may trigger a field evaluation, in which case the product ends up with a field evaluation label that's unique to that location and on a one-time basis, and will give the AHJ something to use as a basis for their approval.